This is Gamble Mash for the October Without a Roof radio program, and it's my real pleasure to have on the phone, dialing in. You from Texas right now, Robert? You back in Texas?
Yes, sir, back in Texas.
Yeah, I got Robert Marbut here from Texas. Robert is a consultant on homelessness, and he's actually worked with hundreds of communities across America over the last 30-some years. You've been doing this. How long have you been doing your work, Robert? And give a quick introduction for yourself. That'd be awesome.
I'm 56, and I've been doing it since I was about 16. So what's that, about 40 years.
Specifically working on homeless issues since you were 16?
Yeah, I started out as a volunteer and was a continuous volunteer. I started out in a high school youth group, like many people do, or college youth group. And then when I went to, I was doing a postgraduate fellowship with the Coro, which is an urban affairs fellowship program, and got asked to be involved with the 1984 Olympics in terms of how the homeless issue is affecting the downtown hotels. And then I later worked for Henry Cisneros as his chief of staff and did homeless issues for him, and then worked for President Bush, the father, in the White House and did homeless issues for him. And then later, when I got elected myself, I was given the portfolio of homeless on city council. And all of that's before I really got serious about it in doing Haven for Hope.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's kind of interesting because I'm a homeless expert since 16 as a runaway in Boston, Massachusetts. I ran away from an abusive situation and walked all the way to Boston. It's kind of interesting for the locality of it, but I walked right by Ed Mayer, executive director of Housing Authority of Butte County. I walked by his whole alma mater, Phillips Academy, on my way to Boston. And I've actually done a lot of work myself, Robert, throughout Northern California and since 2012, visiting communities, some of it experiencing homelessness in Northern California. So I'm really interested to, share get some insights from you and kind of share some of my impressions as well. So no further ado, let's jump in here. Is there anything in that ER article that you feel needs clarification or, restating?
Very good to go. Some things I might emphasize a little more or talk about, but overall I thought it was a great article and really framed a lot of the issues that I see in the community. The one caveat I always give is when I come to a community, I only spent 48 hours there before I start to talk about my observations. And so at the beginning of the talk, I always say I normally get this about 85% right. Again, I was only there 2 days before I started sharing my thoughts, and so I probably miss some nuances, or I miss a certain player, don't hit everybody, but we tried to talk to as many groups, as many individuals as possible, and observe as much as I could in that time frame. But in doing that, there's some things I always miss. That's just reality. Mm-hmm. But I think the big picture observations, like the one that really concerns me the most is the commingling of children with adult males. And I saw that everywhere. Every organization, every gathering, every feeding program I saw, even in the parks, that's just not a good thing to have happen. And that's one of those that no expert, regardless of sort of left-leaning, right-leaning, down the center, would say is a good thing. And so I think that one I got, pretty right on target, but then there might be other ones that I miss a little bit.
Well, let me talk about that one because it was such a fascinating thing. I did this Without a Roof. The first thing we did, Robert, was in Discovery Park, April 2012 in Sacramento. And I set up a media booth, and we did a picnic, and we had well over 100 folks come. It was promoted from Loaves and Fishes, et cetera, et cetera. But someone came over, and one of my volunteers, and said, "Hey, we have a homeless family that wants to talk to you." And I literally, at first, I didn't know who they were meant because they were walking up, didn't fit the stereotypes. But it was a lesbian couple, and they had a 5-year-old and like a 3-year-old. And it was one of the most heartbreaking things I've seen, Robin. I've been doing this myself almost 5 years, in that you could see the physical trauma on these young people. Matter of fact, the 5-year-old was comforting her mom on camera. So it's been really near and dear to my heart, the whole homeless family issue above and beyond. But to me, Robert, it's more of an issue of if you're homeless as a child with a mom and dad or with a family or unattached, you need to be in as normal a setting as possible. And living in a shelter or going to a homeless dinner or something like that is not anywhere near normalcy. That's kind of how I've looked at it. Is there anything you want to expand on that? Or
I couldn't agree more. You want it to be as normal as possible and not as institutionalized as possible. And you want to be as far from that and as I explained to the agencies, was beyond the legal liability, beyond the bad things that could happen with this, beyond your insurance rates going up, beyond any of that, what this does for the long-term mental typing, the developmental level of children, to see adult males in a food shelter line or a barracks or going to the bathroom or whatever, that imprints very badly forever. And that is a trauma that we can reduce, and through better management and just proactive thinking, you want to do everything you can to reduce that, because it hurts the childhood development of that child for the rest of that person's life. And so nothing good happens that way. So I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, I think I'd read somewhere that you're doing work in Placer County. That's where I raised a family, and I'm kind of familiar with their services too. But I think, as you had mentioned, that they have some churches there in Placer County that do homeless feeds, homeless dinners, and they do separate hours. So I couldn't agree with more. I mean, to me, there was a little bit of stigmatization, though, and in some regards, I had some people push back, going, is this a gender issue more than just a behavior issue? And that I don't want listeners to feel that, just because you're homeless as a single male, that children shouldn't be around you. But from a development standpoint, it's a really touchy subject. So
yeah, and it's touching. I get, as you probably know more than anybody, the world of homeless gets people from the far left going, far right going, center. And I deal in reality. I don't deal in hypothetical land. And what we do know is that long-term developmental with the child is not good in that setting. Mm-hmm. What you do know is there's a risk factor involved. There's no checking for background. There's no checking for sexual predator and other such issues that do happen in some of our places, and we know that. And so I deal in the world of reality, and what's happening now needs to change. And I think once everybody had sort of this conversation, everybody says, oh, gosh, that makes total sense. And I know at least two of the agencies were going to have meetings today, literally within 48 hours of me being there, to start talking about how do you separate, how do you deinstitutionalize that. And you can do it physically, or you can do it by time, space, people getting services at different times, or a little of both. And ideally, you want to approximate the real world on the outside with the family as much as you can possibly, regardless of the parent mix type. It doesn't, to me, the parent type doesn't mix. I focus on the kiddos because they're the ultimate victims in this situation. Yeah,
absolutely. So transitioning to the next item, I'm taking a deep breath. Mental health. I mean, it's a really serious issue. And I want listeners to know it's a really serious issue, but please don't be stereotyping, that people are only homeless because they're mentally ill. There's just a tremendous amount of folks that are homeless for one reason or another, but folks that are mentally ill that are out there, they're falling through the safety net, and it's really hard for them to get back up. Anything you'd like to add on that?
The mental health, behavioral health is one of the triggers. It's not the only trigger, but it is one of the triggers in homelessness. And you have some good programs in the area, right in your area, but you simply don't have the volume. You don't have the capacity to handle the need. And so it's not just what type of services you provide, it's having the right type of capacity, being right size. And something that didn't appear in the article that I spent some time talking about is when Ronald Reagan was both governor and president, he felt that should not be a role of government. And so he really pushed hard to reduce federal funding to mental health beds when he was president of the United States. He just simply said that's not something we should be in. And then in a very unusual move, the far left, and I don't mean the center left, I meant the far left, was literally, that was when One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest came out, and a lot of people misunderstood that and thought that was the whole system rather than that one hospital in New York where everybody was sort of focused on. And so the far left joined with the far right. The far right didn't want to spend any money, and the far left said the money was being spent wrong. So they functionally joined together, And now, 30 some odd years later, our federal mental health capacity, and it's hard to measure apple to apple because all the programs have changed, all the funding mechanisms have changed, but the closest you can get, the people I trust in the area, we had about 475,000 beds today Ronald Reagan in. Our country's grown roughly 20%. Now we only have about 92,000 federally funded mental health and behavioral health beds. So that's a cut of 80%, even though our country's grown 20%. And that's a loss of funding. Locally, that reflects itself in how you deal with the 5150s, how you deal with long-term need, how you deal with outpatient care. And so all across the board, there's just not enough funding in mental health. And to be honest, the first time I've heard it at all spoken of in about 20 years was in the early parts of the primaries and in early part of the election this year, in the presidential election. Several candidates started talking about that. And I thought, finally, after 20 years, people are starting to talk about it. Long way to go, but at least I think people are starting to talk about it.
Puts a lot of stress. I know personally, since I call it the work we do, Street Angels, but it puts a lot of pressure on private citizens like Sienna or Lisa Courier that are running around and call them champions, because in a rural setting, a lot of these different places are, here they're in yon, and if you're mentally ill, schizophrenic, and you've been mentally ill all your life, it's kind of hard to navigate the system. So there's just so much need, and so little amount of resources. I really loved your point about the detox center. I had Jennifer Carvello, I don't know if you met with her, she was on about 3 months ago, and they just opened up the very first quote-unquote detox facility here in Butte County, but we're just so desperately shy on those kind of resources, Robert.
And that's another area where it's intermingled, but not it. For some people, it's a co-presenting issue. For other people, it's just a completely different issue. And I think there's a tendency on the right wing in particular to really focus on substance abuse and drug use and such. And I've been around this a long, long time, and I've seen virtually no what I call recreational drug use. You simply can't afford it if you're on the street. But I have seen a lot of self-medicating, substance abuse or misuse. As much as the middle class uses Ambien to go to sleep, if you live out on the street, and I've probably lived on the street 120 days of my life working with different groups, I generally spend 2 or 3 days on the street, at least, sometimes longer, to learn the community, learn the flow and such. And if your temperature outside drops 30 or 40 degrees in a night, you have insects biting you, you might have some lizards or some sort of, bugs or beetles going, you have police hassling you. At the beginning of the month, when you have money in your pocket, because nobody will bank you, so you don't have a bank, so when you get a check, you cash it, and all you have in the pocket, and some street gangs start to roll you for the money. How in the world would you get sleep? If anybody else would have said, you're going to put you outside and do that, you're going to have to take Ambien to go to sleep. And so a lot of the substance abuse is misunderstood as simply being able to try to go to sleep at night, and how hard it is to sleep at night. And then you add to that dehydration, which occurs partly because you don't have enough fluids on the street, and partly because they don't want to be arrested or get a ticket or be hassled by the police for urinating in public. And so you have chronic dehydration on top of sleep deprivation. So whatever you got going, everything's exacerbated. Everything is made worse for lack of good sleep and lack of improper hydration, let alone nutrition and everything else along the line.
Because there's fun, shout out to Bobby Walden, runs the HUD Bash program here, Robert. But he had said to me after I got housed through HUD Bash, it said, at least I didn't have, any mental illness issues. And he stopped me. He's an MSW. He said, no, I want you to know here right now, MASH, that if you're homeless, chronic homeless, you've been out there 6, 8, 10 months. If you're homeless, you're experiencing mental anguish. You're in a mental health issue, period. And it really resonated with me 2 years ago, but I see that everywhere I go. I mean, it is such a traumatic experience.
And that is so right, because you have the trauma of the original trigger, whatever your original trigger was, but then you have the trauma of living on the street, and so you sort of get this double trauma going. And in some issues, like the new emerging one, military sexual trauma, and I had worked real hard to try to get the VA and the feds and DOD to realize you got a real problem there. And unfortunately, with the federal government, unless you codify it or give it a name, you don't get help. And so they finally have come out this year with military sexual trauma. And for the ladies that are having that, they sort of have the mix of post-traumatic stress syndrome plus basically domestic violence combined in one. And so in many cases, people have a tertiary trauma level that if we don't deal with, things will be worse later.
I appreciate that issue because I actually have talked a lot about domestic violence, in front of audiences. But I was just on CSU campus here talking about that very issue at a Veterans Voices. I was a Veteran Voice presenter last month, and I talked a lot about sexual assault and PTSD. So thank you so much for that work, Robert. I'm gonna come down here to they paraphrase it as tough talks, and the way they had worded it, Robert, was programs that provide food to the hungry are common and well-meaning. Yet the community is not having enough conversations about whether you are enabling. So maybe you could explain that sentence, particularly the use of enabling and what that implies.
What I believe is if you're an agency, and this is really addressed toward agencies and organizations and initiatives, is that you got to have your brain going and you got to have your heart going. You got to have both going at the same time. And when you provide help, not all help is good. Likewise, not all help is bad. And so you got to really figure out what type of help engages person into recovery. My number one measurement is how many people graduate from the street forever. I don't measure how many sleeping bags get taken out, how many plates of food get served, how many tents get handed out. I measure things like, do we drop the number of people in jail? Because I just think criminalization is a waste of time, waste of money, and it doesn't help the individual. I measure how many people are no longer going to the emergency room. I measure how many people graduate permanently from the street. I measure how many people get permanent market rate housing. And so when you focus on that, rather than some intermediate steps or some really output steps, you really have to start to say what are we doing as an organization engaging people into long-term recovery, or are you sustaining a person and not getting recovery, not moving toward recovery? And I think you got to have very honest conversations about it. And I'm not saying there's a perfect answer or it's that black and white, but you want to be healthy about it, and you're healthy by having a conversation. Is what we're doing really helping a person work toward graduation?
I'm really glad for that clarification. I'm actually going to land on this for just a little bit longer because it's kind of near and dear to my heart. I've done a lot of, outreach, on the streets to homeless folks, giving them food hither and yon. And it was actually Ed Mayer again, about 3 years ago, I mentioned hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Did a lot of research on it 3 years ago, and I think it's a very sound approach, looking at if someone's hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, they are experiencing anguish, and either of those four things needs to be eliminated. So a lot of the work I do and a lot of the quote-unquote private citizens that aren't attached to a nonprofit is related to trying to alleviate those symptoms. So when we read this sentence, I want to make sure when I read that sentence, you're more applying it to service agencies in town like the Torres Shelter and the Jesus Center versus someone giving out a peanut butter sandwich on the street.
Well, it can be also for the individual, but my real target in the context of that forum was how do agencies address it. But I will also flip it and say it can be individuals too. But and I was working in a place in St. Petersburg, Florida, in a park. That's a famous park down there in the West Tampa area. And it struck me that the first day I got there to help out, there were 7 meals fed in that park during the day. Not one of them was healthy. Not one of them was nutritious. Some of them were actually very non-nutritious. Some were in the middle of the road. Some were just like donuts. And when you're feeding in a park 6, 7, 8 times a day, very unhealthy food, that's not moving the ball. That's not helping a person toward graduation. We want to think about nutrition. We want to think about hydration. We want to think about sleep and sleep deprivation, because if you mess up those three, whatever you have going, whether it's a substance issue, whether it's mental health, the behavioral health, post-traumatic stress, acute stress, domestic violence, lack of nutrition, lack of hydration, lack of sleep makes everything worse. And so I like to think of it as a very holistic system. And I don't think you ever get to perfect. I think some very good people on both sides might have slight disagreements. But I do think you should always be honest about what we're doing and ask the question, are we enabling or are we engaging? Are we moving a person toward recovery or are we keeping a person toward recovery?
What do you think of Food Not Bombs? They serve a lot of nutritious meals across the country.
Yeah, some do. And what I've encouraged that group, because in some cities I've worked in and around them, I always encourage any food programs to be aligned with programs that deal with the root cause of the homeless, the mental health, the behavioral health, the post-traumatic stress, the domestic violence. And if you align the feeding program with the behavioral health, the mental health, and other, you get really good results. When you disalign those and everybody's out working independently, you don't get as good a success rate as you can. I'm all about trying to get as many graduates as I can.
We'll move on for that one, but we'll just have some level of, because we don't have time. I think if we would talk more on this, we might come up with more agreement. But I don't find, giving people food enabling. But what I would add, though, Robert, because I agree with a lot that you're saying, I don't just give people food, I engage them. I'll go down and sit with them. Hey, so what's going on? I heard you lost your house. I mean, this is kind of the street outward stuff that you're talking about. And I've been to places, Robert, that serve food, and you're like, oh my God, I don't ever want to go there again. They look like I was in prison. So I think there's a lot around that we could maybe do a separate interview.
No, I agree. But let me give you one extreme one. I was working in a city, absolute real-life city in Florida, and a motorcycle group, a little motorcycle club, every Wednesday night would go buy 300 hamburgers at McDonald's, and McDonald's gave them a cheap rate. And they would drive along in the two pairs of two, sort of like a group of pot of four. They would hit each intersection, and they would do this all over town. And they literally threw hamburgers out like you were seeing, something being thrown out at Mardi Gras. And I thought it was one of the most disrespectful, undignified things that I've ever seen. And when you're just throwing food off of a motorcycle, if that's not enabling, I don't know what it is. And it's certainly not engaging. It's not engaging a person in recovery. It looked more like this horrible exhibit at a zoo. And that's why I think when you do it with other programs or engagement as you described it, where you're really developing the relationship and you're working toward a recovery, I'm all in for that. But a lot of programs simply aren't that. And you go out on the street, you see some programs, and you just scratch your head and you go, oh my gosh. So, and I know that may be a different conversation for a different time.
Maybe we'll make this part one. Part one of two.
There you go.
Part one of two, the sequel to come. The next one's going to be panhandling with Robert Marbut. Any closing comments, Robert, before I let your family head off to the first presidential debate? Yeah,
one thing I wanted to say is that, there's always a tendency when we do these sorts of interviews to sort of focus on the gaps, the 5150, the lack of housing, and what have you. But I got to say, your community of Chico is one of the nicest communities of people who really like each other. If you look at my comments I make in other cities, I'll be very honest, very vocal about the problems. I have never seen a community who so sincerely, on a whole, wants to work with each other to do the right thing. People may have honest disagreements on how to do it, but there's a real sincerity in when I've never seen a situation where one agency got into financial trouble and all the other agencies gathered around to help them and say, we need to support them and prop them up. I've never seen that before. Virtually every other place I've seen is another agency might kick the chair out of them while they're struggling. And to see agencies in the community line up to help that one agency that was struggling, that is just so unusual. And it also, rings to what a special community Chico is.
I'll lead with that on part two. I kind of like this. We'll schedule some time when I get back from Florida, man.
Would love to. Thank you very much for having me on.